Welcome to NewYorkBIO's webinar series. This week, we've partnered with BioNJ to bring you a webinar on threats to innovation, foreign price controls, featuring Duane Shulthess from Vital Transformation.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Threats to Innovation webinar. It seems like a scary title, but the scariness is real. And this type of legislation that we're going to be talking about today, and the type of policy decisions that we're going to discuss, could have a real impact. It's interesting. New York and New Jersey are at sort of very different places in our historical growth. New Jersey has long been known as the nation's medicine chest. And New York has very early stage companies, with the exception of a few outliers. And it's been interesting to think about how these policy decisions will impact both companies that have long been located in places like New Jersey and been providing therapeutics and cures to the world, and those that are new, both in New Jersey and New York, who are really working hard to raise capital to develop therapeutics and cures that will really impact. I don't think we have to go back very far to know that in a small amount of time, our bioscience companies can really make an impact on our world health. We didn't know we could do it as fast as we did over the last 18 months, but we've seen that happen, and we've seen the real impact of that. So we're glad you're here with us today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. As a housekeeping measure, please ask your questions as we go through the conversation. Put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and Debbie and I will get to them and pass them on to Duane as we receive them. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, my next door neighbor from New Jersey, Debbie Hart. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that kind introduction. And it's always wonderful to partner with you. And I can't wait till we can get back on the Hudson for our bio cruise, perhaps next summer. So good morning, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm Debbie Hart, the president and CEO of BioNJ, the Trade Association for Life Sciences in New Jersey. And echoing Jennifer's remarks, thank you for joining us today for a very special briefing on reference pricing and its impact on patient access and innovation. And I hope you've been staying safe and well in this really just crazy last 18 months. And as you know, we hope BioNJ's mission is to help our members help patients. And as our tagline states, it's because patients can't wait, and they can't. And I've never been more proud, hearkening back to what Jennifer said, to represent this industry than I am today. Our industry is literally saving the world, and BioNJ and NewYorkBIO members have had a very significant hand in that. But the R&D system that has allowed innovation to thrive in this critical time and that brought vaccines to address COVID-19 in record time is under threat, as are the innovations of the smallest companies focused on rare and orphan diseases. So HR 3, the Prescription Drug Affordability Board proposal, and the Trump administration's most favored nation model are examples of proposals that would use price controls to address drug pricing. But what these proposals would instead reduce is the innovation that's brought treatments for conditions once thought untreatable to the patients who need them most. And these proposals would undeniably reduce the ability of American patients to access cutting-edge therapies and treatments. Most importantly, there's little evidence that these proposals would address the most important goal of any effort seeking to address drug pricing, and that's reducing the cost a patient pays at the pharmacy counter. That's just really the key, and it doesn't happen with these proposals. We believe there's a right way and a wrong way to address drug pricing. Reference pricing proposals is the wrong way. So you may have seen a recent report on this issue circulated by the Council of State Bioscience Associations, Biocom, and the California Life Sciences Association. And the report, written by Vital Transformation, shows the staggering impact of reference pricing on the life sciences continuum. The report's data show revenue reductions of more than $100 billion and massive economic upheaval. In New Jersey alone, the data predict job losses in excess of 70,000 and significant declines in investment and economic output. but the economics pale in comparison to the impact on patient access to innovative treatments, in particular, small patient populations whose treatments will likely remain just undiscovered if these proposals are in place. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the author of this important report, Vital Transformation. He's going to take a deeper dive into the data. Please welcome Managing Director for Vital Transformation, Duane Shulthess. Duane, thank you so much for being here and for your important work. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you all of you who are watching remotely. It's a pleasure. Our life lives on the internet now. And this is how we do things now, and that's great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I should say it wasn't just my work. We also worked very closely with our consulting economist, Dr. Harry Bowen, who I knew back in the day from KU Leuven University and Stern University, Stern Business School in New York, as well as the U.S. former economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, and also my business partner who runs our U.S. operations, Dr. Joe Hamming, also worked very closely with us on this study. Now, I'm going to go through quite a bit of this. I'm also bringing in some work from the NIH study that we just released, because it's also quite relevant, because it would appear that the default position now that we have coming out of the Congress is, well, if it's not up to the industry, we can have the NIH take over this, and we've done a lot of work there. So I'll touch on that as well. I'll also give some historical context as to how, essentially price ceilings and price controls have happened, what the impact's been in Europe as well. So what does HR3 do? For those of you who are not fully informed, I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm sure most of you are well acquainted with the bill. Essentially what it does is it takes up to 250 single source non-generic drugs. That's 125 drugs that are hardwired into Part D, as well as 125 other drugs that can be from Parts D and B, but actually it doesn't limit it to that. It could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to Part Medicare per se. And then what it does is it sets those drugs up on a continuum. It takes the average price of those drugs based on a basket of other countries internationally. So the US would no longer set our own drug prices per se. Those prices would be determined by the prices paid in Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and the UK. Now, it doesn't just allow these prices to go into Medicare. Those prices would then also be allowed to and would be offered to the commercial market. That's group insurance, PBMs, private insurance, and that's under Section 1196B of the bill, which I'm sure you all have memorized. So the point is that these prices then can be rolled out globally. Any price control inflation rates are, you can't keep raising the price. For example, it's going to be held to the price of inflation. Now, these days, it's 5% a year. But, we'll have to see what happens as things go on. And the other point about this is this average, once you come down to this average price, and this is where I think a lot of people get a little fooled or they get confused. Well, you get 120% of the average. But the problem is, particularly when you look at neurological disorders, you're dropping by over 50, 60% by the current US price. So adding 20% to a deflated price only gets you, a certain percentage back. It's not all that in a bag of crisps, as the Brit would say. It's actually doesn't really help you out very much. It's quite limiting. So that doesn't really impact. It's really, the cost reductions are so huge. And again, that's the absolute best price you can do is this 120%. The maximum fair price is going to be negotiated by CMS. And that is determined somewhere between the lowest price in the basket and this 120% price. So actually, all of our analysis is based on the 120%. So the numbers you're going to see would probably be, if this was implemented, significantly lower. This is actually a best case scenario, believe it or not. So what did we do? Well, the bill has a minimum implementation. Now, this was written from last year that's since been updated in the remarking of the bill that came out last month. So the minimums are 25 drugs, not in 2023, it's actually 2024, and 50 drugs in 2025. So basically in year one, the minimum you can do is 25 of the top drugs in year one and 50 drugs in year two. Now, what's interesting is by the time you get to 50 drugs, you're really capturing the impact is so huge. You can go up to 250. We decided not to because by the time we got up to 151 drugs with insulin, it was irrelevant. In all cases, whatever you do, insulin is pulled out and put through this pricing model separately. It's not clearly defined. We assume it's the same model, the same basket, but again, that's not necessarily clearly written in the bill. but we're just making the assumption that it is handled in the same fashion where it's done in an average of the 6 prices of the 6 markets. And then we also looked at what we considered a full implementation. We had the pricing on 175 drugs, including insulin. By the time we got to the 125 plus the 26 insulin, the impacts were so enormous. And the marginal impact of each individual drug beyond 125 was quite marginal. So that's kind of where we stopped. And then what we also looked at was the behavior of the industry that would be impacted by these pricing changes over the past 10 years. So if we look back and say, okay, if this had been in place over the last 10 years, what is the statistical impact on innovation in the innovation ecosystem based on deals that actually occurred? How would this happen statistically? And I'll walk you through all that modeling. A couple things here. So what are the key findings? Well, the key findings are essentially, even with the minimal impact, which is the 50 drugs in year 2, including insulin, that gives us 102 billion base case. In other words, you're going to lose 102 billion in revenue, and that's the best case scenario. That's using 120%, not the midpoint price between the lowest price and the best optional price, as well as insulin. So if you take everything that you've got for the 50 drugs, you're still looking at 102 billion. Now, the industry averages over the last 3 years, give or take, the the EBIT for the sector in the companies that would be impacted is roughly about 160 billion. So you're really talking a 65% cut on revenue earnings. I mean, that's really going to be devastating, both for shareholder price as well as free cash flow. I mean, this is really going to impact the sector hugely. What's interesting is it doesn't hit everybody equally. A certain percentage of companies, top quartile, the top quarter of companies, even in the minimal implementation, lose 120% of their earnings before annuity and tax. In other words, the bottom line, their results, what you would report in your shareholder statements. A quarter of the companies lose 121% of that. So you're really driving the companies into loss. And those were the best performing companies. And the irony here is that there's no accounting for quality of drugs, impact of drugs, how the drugs defer costs, how the drugs may, for example, in Sovaldi, how it prevents liver transplants for 1 in 5 patients. None of that's accounted for. It just looks at price. It doesn't look at effectiveness or cost deferment. It just looks at what the price is today, not what it does for the system 5-10 years from now, which is pretty odd. So it really is penalizing companies who have the best drugs, the most drugs in the most innovative areas where we're lacking, treatments where we have high unmet medical needs. So the bill is somewhat perverse in the fact that it really hits the companies who have focused on oncology, neurology, Parkinson's disease, areas where we have a lot of challenges. That's really where the key impacts are. Also, it would impact down the tail because the revenues would be so lacking. Orphan drugs will be hugely impacted, as well as, companies would likely try to avoid Medicare Part B and D in the future. They would do everything possible to try and stay out of those baskets. A couple of the things, if we look at the ecosystem, and I mentioned how the companies have behaved, the companies now are working in partnership and in consort with a lot of small and emerging biotechs, and they're investing and sending out revenue and liquidity in partnerships. In New Jersey, you're one of the key drivers of this. A lot of the corporates are there, and those companies, those big firms, the J&Js, the Novartises, who are based there, are reaching out and investing in. A lot is in Massachusetts and a lot is in California, but a lot is in New Jersey and in New York as well. And what you find is that's $500 million over 10 years, 50 billion a year. It's almost equal to the R&D budgets. And we found 215 partnership deals that were signed potentially by companies who would be impacted by HR3, accounting for that close to $500 million. And we're not even including large M&A, J&J's acquisition of Actelion, AbbVie and Allergan, BMS and Celgene. We're leaving those off the table. If you include those, you're close to $750 million. We're really just looking at the small emerging biotechs. And what you find is that 100 billion a year is twice the annual current investment. So this would have a devastating impact on that behavior. And, we would see, enormous drops of 68 new assets emerging from these pipelines to, well, we think 7. And again, I'll walk you through the statistics. If that sounds like a big number, we think it's probably quite accurate. And alone, for example, California is 25% of that total. So California alone accounts for 17 of those 68 drugs. 122 billion of that 487 billion of investments, roughly a quarter. And again, we would see California's input going from 17 to 2. Now, I know that doesn't help with New Jersey per se, but it just shows a state impact that we have calculated, and it just shows these would have devastating localized impacts on what would happen to your biotech infrastructure. So I'm going to give a little historical perspective about what pricing controls have done in Europe and look at how the EU actually operates. I think Americans are not really aware of how HTAs and how these practices have actually impacted innovation and why prices are, people have such a jaundiced view about why is the EU so much cheaper than the US. And it's a fair criticism, obviously, because it's, driving politicians to act. So let's take a look at this historically. If you look at what just happened, for example, with the vaccines and put this into a context of what a price ceiling does. If you look at, gas lines under Richard Nixon, again, I'm grayer, I'm a little older than probably most of you. In 1973, OPEC, the oil monopoly, the oligopoly, put in price controls and raised radically the price of oil, almost overnight. And Richard Nixon then put in pricing controls for a gallon of gasoline, and that led to huge shortages. If you look at the Soviet Union and recently Venezuela, who put in pricing controls on the cost of food, that leads to supply shocks. This is what happens inevitably when you lower the price of assets below the demand curve. And Europe decided to embark on a strategy where they were going to uniquely negotiate as a bloc on their vaccine acquisition strategy for COVID-19. It wasn't about acquiring volume for inoculations. It was actually controlling cost, which has turned out to be a foolish approach to the vaccine strategy, because what ended up happening is, for example, Pfizer had a contract to deliver 200 million units in the United States by June. The European Union has a similar contract. They don't deliver until September. So this has been an abject failure. And in Belgium, for example, they saved 125 million on their vaccine acquisitions, roughly $12 a pop for each shot, but at the cost of 30 billion in lost GDP. So this has been a failed strategy. And plus, it means that they're getting the vaccines very slow. If we look at Israel, now this is from a couple months ago when I ran the hard data. If we looked at Israel, they're doing 1% a day, 1.1% of their population a day is being vaccinated. That means Israel's basically done now. They've done, in 91 days, they can do the entire population. The United Kingdom and the United States were running about 0.5% a day. Belgium's doing 0.1% a day. Where I'm here in Belgium now, it's going to take over 800 days to vaccinate the population from March 1st. I mean, this is a disaster. And this is what happens when you see the pharmaceutical sector. What they are doing is by putting in price controls, and what the object of when Secretary Azar promoted this at Brookings Institute in October of 2018, when they announced this plan under what was called then the IPI, the International Pricing Initiative, the idea was to try and force drug companies to raise prices in Europe. It's not like there hasn't been an effort to do this. If you look at what happened with the cystic fibrosis drug of Vertex, essentially the UK, the NHS, threatened to take their intellectual property in a compulsory license. This has been going on forever. People, even though Europe is cheaper, they delay entry for hundreds of days, as I've just shown you with the vaccine. It takes 550 days right now for oncology products to come to market in France, just today, right now. And they're also threatening companies who they cannot come to a pricing agreement just to actually compulsory license and take their intellectual property. Plus, those companies working on gene therapies, for example, or human-derived tissue autologous therapies, stem cell therapies, CAR T therapies, obviously J&J, very active, Novartis, very active in New Jersey. This is the words of Eduardo Bravo, not my words. And he discusses that there's something called the hospital exemption, where human-derived tissue in Europe does not need to go through the standard, what would be the equivalent FDA procedure. That can be authorized on a state-by-state level by the local health authorities through the hospitals. This is called a hospital exemption. And this happened to his company, Tygenix. They were cannibalized by the hospital exemption with autologous therapies, which is why they switched to an entire new pipeline, even though Tygenix had the very first stem cell ever approved. Anybody working on CAR T or gene therapies is going to get eaten alive by the hospital exemption in Europe. You will not be able to raise prices. It's going to be impossible. They will cannibalize you. This is happening now with CAR T therapies as we speak. So what's been the impact of putting in these pricing controls and HTA systems in Europe since 1980? Well, what you can see here, these are the amount of products that came to market in 1961. You can see France and Germany were roughly close to level playing with the United States. But look at what happens here in 1991 to 2000. The US now is dominating. France has bled its biotech and biopharma sector. And this is happening, this is accelerated since this study from the millennia. This has actually gotten worse. And there was a really interesting study by Egger and Malik in the Health Economics Review in 2014 that shows that the more exposure you have to the European market, the less presence you will have with R&D investments. In other words, the less productivity you get in Europe, the more exposure you have to the European market. This is why Europe is bleeding its biotech sector. Bringing in Europe's pricing will import Europe's economics. We have to be very, very careful with what we do. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And in the immortal words of economist Thomas Sowell, there is no good or bad, there are just trade-offs. You will be getting trade-offs of less industry and less innovation, much as Europe has with their decisions. So with that, let's look at HR3 specifically, starting here with the minimal implementation of 25 drugs. You can see the vast majority of products that are hit: oncology, rheumatology, neurology, and then a spread of others across the spectrum here. Again, what you see, we go from in these asset classes here in year 132 billion to 80 billion. That's roughly a 40% loss of revenue, 39-ish percent. By the time we get to 50 in year two, we go from 218 billion to 133 billion. Again, roughly a 40% loss, but you can see the numbers here again go up: oncology, rheumatology, immunology, neurology, areas where we currently have very, very, very large areas of high unmet medical needs. And again, you can see here, neurology, 64% reductions in pricing. Again, I understand this is controversial. I understand people are upset. I understand this is political win. It's an easy win. It's an easy issue to articulate. However, there are going to be high penalties for rolling this out. So now we take those losses, we incorporate in the insulin drugs, and then this is where we get, even in the minimal implementation, this is where our $102 billion number comes from. Now, as I mentioned, the impact of this is not equal across all the companies. It's additive. The more innovative products you have that demand a high price and are commanding market position, the more impact you will have. So you can see companies that have 4 drugs. So are several companies that focus on injectable oncology. They get hit very hard, very badly by this bill. Anybody who has more than 4 drugs, the average is 9 billion in losses. More than 2 drugs, 2 billion in losses. Well, more than 1 drug, a little less than $1 billion. So again, the more drugs you have that fall into this, it's additive. It's rather arbitrary. You get hammered. You can see here, again, the top 25%, even in the minimal implementation, a quarter, the top quartile of the drugs, companies with drugs impacted, lose 121% of their gross earnings. That's going to have a huge impact on the sector. Now, we scale this up, as I mentioned, this is the full implementation of 125 plus insulin. You can see here, now, if you remember, we were at 102 billion roughly, including insulin here. Even though we've added 75 drugs, we've only added about 23 billion here in the total impact. So again, by the time you get beyond this 125, the impact's marginal. You've really done most of the damage here on the revenue side of the balance sheet by the time you get to 125 drugs. And what's interesting is it's still consistent at about 39-40% of gross revenues for all sales, which is intriguing. But you can also see here 24 oncology products, 21 pulmonology, rheumatology. So again, areas where we have high unmet medical needs. By the time we roll in insulin, we're at 142 billion. And again, 8 drugs or more, 12 billion for companies who have 8 or more drugs. And there are many companies who would get hit in this catchment of 125 drugs for 12 billion or more. 4 drugs, 4 billion, 2 drugs, 2 billion roughly, 1 drug, 1 billion. And again, what's intriguing here is it's not as acute, the impact on the top quartile, but it's wider, it's deeper. If you look at the impacts here, 50% lose roughly half or 70% of their earnings. So half of the companies are losing about 70% of their gross earnings, their bottom line a year, for what they would be reporting to shareholders. This would have a devastating impact on the sector. And probably most pointedly, if you look at both implementations, regardless of if it's the 23 implementation of 23 companies impacted with 50 drugs or 37 companies impacted with 125 drugs, essentially a third of the companies in both cases lose more than 95% of their annual earnings. So this really will devastate the sector. We mentioned earlier the job impacts. You can see New Jersey is the second most impacted by this. This is the 71,000 jobs number here, total biopharma jobs impacted as a whole. You can see that. And then obviously we have this for all the countries. I just put down the I don't want to say the leading, but at least the most impacted. So you can see in the United States as a whole, you're losing close to 1 million jobs. So the ecosystem impacts quickly. I'll go through this. What do we see here? I mentioned earlier, $500 million in investments in 215 deals over 10 years. What does this mean? Well, again, I mentioned how if we go back to that Demarich study from Harvard, going back to 1980, you can see how dominant is the US now? Extremely dominant. You can see the investments of that $500 billion, 419 billion is in the US. Now, that's not just your companies. That's not just J&J. That's not just the New Jersey-based companies. That is Pfizer. That is also GSK. That is also Roche. That is also AstraZeneca. Everybody globally is working and investing in the United States. This would have a devastating impact globally on inward investment. It's not just the US companies, it's everybody and who is investing in US intellectual property, which I will get into about the NIH quickly. Again, you can see the gross numbers here. Again, New Jersey, 74 billion over this 10 years would be sucked out of the Jersey economy potentially. California is still number one, Massachusetts number three, and then there's, the numbers sort of fall off quite extremely after we get past Massachusetts. But again, these are not small numbers. This is California. And again, if we look at Massachusetts, we've got New Jersey here. Pharmacet, I'd like to point out that was the acquisition for Sovaldi. So, that's now a cure for hepatitis C. A lot of these things probably would not have occurred. This would have a devastating impact on the Jersey economy and would put at risk a lot of this M&A activity. I'll go through the rest. And again, we're not making up this impact. If you look at how the investments flowed, we found statistically, and you can look on our website and see how we've peer review published a lot of these models. Early and mid-stage venture capital is an extremely good predictor of market entry, statistically so. And what you can see here are total investments. These are the products that did not come to market. This is a logistic regression. And you can see here, these are the products and total investments that did not come to market. And these are the products that did come to market. So these are the 68 products that did. And you can see this regression line that shows a very good p-value. And you can see here that roughly 50% investment require a 50% probability. So a coin flip requires about $5.2 billion of investment. And this is a very statistically sound model. What this means is we've put money in and we know that the amount of revenue that's contributed to these assets is statistically significant in their market entry. We can then pull revenue out. So we then pull the revenue out and we can see here, for example, this cardiovascular drug with the current revenue scenario had a 73% probability of market entry. And you can see here it drops to 49%. So that would likely no longer come to market. And you can see here that there's a lot of stuff that is quite unlikely that came to market. And again, there would be a radical compression of this sector and no one would be risking these anymore because they would not be able to get a return on investment to quantify and validate these investments. They would be focusing over here on the large indications. Again, where we would end up is where we were in 1999 when everyone was complaining about the Me Too cardiovascular drugs. That's where we'll end up. Targeted therapies, orphan drugs, anything, Alzheimer's disease, those things would vanish because the possibility of getting a return on investment is highly unlikely. And again, the numbers just get worse the larger the revenue reductions. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can go through this. You can download this off our website. And again, I've also looked at California. I'm not going to go through that in detail. Again, you can look at this on our website. Quickly, what are the core findings here? Well, again, you're looking at a 62% potential loss of revenue with the larger indications. people are not going to do their work here. They're going to go somewhere where they can get a return on investment. This is going to cause huge growth in China, Singapore, and Korea. Investors are going to go there. Already you have 250 CAR T trials last year in China, 140 in the United States, only 30 in Europe. Again, you're going to see more innovation go where you can get prices. And ultimately, you can read this on your own. What will happen is companies will avoid circulating drugs in Europe. They will withdraw from the negotiations. They will not circulate pricing in Europe. They will just focus on the US. And ultimately, what's going to happen is a lot of people in Europe are not going to get drugs. Now, maybe the US wants that. Maybe they will, but then we have to anticipate that there will be reactions and aggressive actions by the countries who are no longer getting these life-saving drugs, and they will then probably threaten compulsory licenses and IP, and that would require the government to then enter trade disputes through the WTO. I don't see this administration necessarily going down that path. Certainly with some of the discussions we're hearing around the IP waivers around the vaccines, that may not occur. Again, I would hate to bank on that given the current political environment in the United States. Just be aware this could have a devastating impact on the sector overall, and companies will be defensive and they're not going to sacrifice 5% of their sales volume for 75 to 80% of their profitability in the US where the market lives. So obviously, one of the things that people are saying is, well, then we're going to pivot everything to the NIH. The NIH will discover drugs. What did we do? Well, we looked at 23,000 NIH grants from the year 2000, which represented 70% of the total NIH funding from the year 2000. We identified 8,200 patents that were created under the Bayh-Dole regime that were then marketed and had assets that were claimed within existing products that came to clinical research. There were 41 drugs that came to clinical research, and of those we identified 8,226 patents that were part of those 41 drugs that led to 41 products. Now, obviously, not all 8,000 patents were tied to those 41 products. We then looked at each individual patent in every 41 drug for all years, and we identified a total of 511 patents that could be tied to the NIH. Now, of those 511 patents in the 41 products, roughly 18 came to market. And then we looked at all of the individual financing rounds and all of the contributions to those assets from the private sector, as well as all of the grants from the NIH. And even if a patent was from, say, 1999 before the drug came to market, but then often, as you see with the NIH, the grants go for 10, 15 years beyond that, we included all of the revenue. So we gave a very broad reach to NIH funding in the context of this research. And what did we find? Well, what we found is in the drugs that came to market, the 18 products that were approved, the private sector gave 44 billion and the NIH gave 670 million in total. You can see that overwhelmingly, again, we have one product that had a large late stage acquisition prior to approval, but you also see here 8 million and 8 billion, 8 million and 3 billion, 5 million and 1.3 billion. So again, we're talking orders of magnitude of private funding to NIH. Now, statistically, does that matter? We'll get to that later. Obviously, that's a fair question, so we ran some statistics on this too. You can see how this breaks down by clinical area. Again, 5 million to 5 billion by oncology, 100 million to 2 billion for neurology, endocrinology, and et cetera, et cetera. This little blue part is the NIH contribution. Now, what's really intriguing here, and I think this is probably the key finding, of the 41 assets and of those that did not come to market, the 23 assets that did not come to market, there's a substantial investment by the industry and by private investors to test those out and to test the waters. And this runs afoul of a lot of the narrative that the industry is just creaming off the best IP and not really sinking their teeth into these things to try and determine if all the assets have value. No, that's not what we see at all here. We see several $billion, particularly in phase 2, which is, fail early, which is great. This was actually heartening. I was glad to see the larger investment in phase 2. And what's intriguing here is even on those assets that didn't come to market, there's a substantial investment here for them to test and see if they have market potential. So this is quite intriguing. And we're currently publishing this research now. We're in the process of working on a study. So I do think this is one of the core findings in the deck. Also, what's intriguing, if you look at the actual assets in total, the 18 that came to market, obviously we didn't include the one that was just bought in October because there is no peak sales. I mean, 4 of these had relatively no sales at all. And really, when you get to 143 million here, most of these are probably breaking even ish, but the vast majority of these are losing money. And it's really only 3 or 4 of these drugs here that are blockbusters per se, that are essentially paying for everything else. But let's not kid ourselves. A lot of these assets are orphan drugs and rare diseases. And if we don't have them there, someone will not be treated. So the system now, essentially there's a subsidy tail that happens from the blockbusters, similar to what you see in the Hollywood film industry, where, the Avengers is paying for, a margin call, a sort of small, intimate movie that's character driven. It's not just everything Avengers. And unfortunately, where we'll end up with HR3 is probably everything Avengers. And we're going to lose the sort of small, intimate margin calls and things like that are character driven pieces, which, we need these drugs, unfortunately, because until we have cures. And the fact is, these do treat people. Statistically, again, we've presented this to NCATS, we presented this internally at the NIH several times. And one of the questions is, well, is this just a reflection of the more money drives success regardless? Well, no. What we see here, when there's 0% private financing, and this is total private funding is the mix of funding, there's always a certain percentage of NIH funding because that's our baseline. We assume there's an NIH grant. So when there's 0% private financing, there's 0% probability of market entry. What you see here is these products that came to market, when you see over 90% a private market contribution to the asset, you get a roughly 60% probability of market entry. And again, p-value, these are small numbers, it's only 40. So there's a lot of variance here. So yeah, it's not a p minus 0.0000, but it's a strong statistical, it's 1 in 100. We'll take that, we'll say that's good. And what it shows is overwhelmingly, it's the private sector that is dictating, well, statistically it is saying, it's the private sector that determines success. So with that, I will stop. I hope I've been through a ton of material. Went 5 minutes over, sorry about that. But if you have any questions, please, I look forward to taking them, and I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Duane. Yeah, so Debbie and I have a few questions for you.
I'm sure you do.
And then for those of you listening in, please just submit your questions in the Q&A and chat, and we'll get to them. So we talked a lot about HR3, and granted, there was no reason for us to go through all of the details. But I think one thing that people will want to understand more about is sort of what is the trajectory and process. And just for reference, I know that, and for everyone's understanding, this bill has been reintroduced in this Congress, right? It was around last Congress, it's been reintroduced. And I think it's been referred to four different committees in the House, right? And so it's not like it just has to go through one committee and then to the floor for potential passage. So give us your best guess on sort of what the process is going to be from a legislative perspective.
I think that's going to depend if this goes through reconciliation or not, if they're going to try and attach it to some other bill. Again, we're not a lobbying firm, we're a health economic firm. I should preface this by saying our largest client base in Europe is the public sector. We work with governments. So we don't pick dogs and fights in this one necessarily. We just run the numbers and say, hey, look, here's what's going to happen. I think when it was initially passed, and the bill was even more aggressive before, there are some paybacks and clawbacks now about trying to put dental in and things like that I do think are worthwhile and valid. And those parts of the bill that were added since the previous revision are good. I do think interestingly enough, though, is that this bill had overwhelming support from one side of the aisle in California and Massachusetts. And ironically, I think those people who were very supportive of the initial draft of the bill realized, oh my word, this is going to actually crush our biotech sector. So I do think there is a hard reality that is catching hold. Yeah, of course you can this way. Essentially, you can put rent controls in like they've done in New York too in the 70s. That caused huge problems where people it was more beneficial for people. If you remember Bronx's burning, people were burning down buildings because they couldn't actually afford to renovate them and they couldn't afford to rent them anymore. There are consequences to decisions like this. I think there's some level of sanity that is being approached to this. My concern is that this is such a political issue. My father's an entrepreneur. He has thyroid issues. He has to take quite expensive thyroid medication. And he understands business and he understands our work. He understands math, but he's like, well, it's really unfair. Canadians don't pay what we pay. I get it. I totally get it. It's political red meat, and it's going to be hard to avoid that. I do think that there's enough common sense around this now to realize this particular bill, HR3, may not pass in its current function. They're trying new options. There's the Grassley bill and other things in the Senate that they're trying to get. I don't know if they're going to get consensus. I do not know. But I do know, regardless, the fact that neurological products are 60% more expensive in the United States compared to the basket, that's a problem. And I understand that. I would rather see this become a trade issue. I think this needs to be a trade negotiation between Joe Biden and the European Commission, rather than a pharmaceutical company going into the wolves in the UK Parliament and being, no one is going to lose a vote, dragging a US pharmaceutical company over the coals. That's not going to happen. And that's the political reality.
Yeah. Hey, one follow on to that. Do you think that sort of COVID and the rapid development of therapeutics and vaccines has had an impact on the way policymakers think about this type of legislation?
Yes and no. Again, I'm somewhat jaundiced because my seat where I'm talking to you now is in my office in Brussels, which has been a basket case on how they've managed COVID-19, both from had #1 death rate per capita, and it's been, an absolute failure in the management of the vaccine strategy. I think you have to look at this, unfortunately, from the view of the consumer who has been locked down for a year and unfortunately maybe has lost a business, which many people in Europe and the United States have due to local politics in many cases. Also, there's been a lot of political baggage thrust upon one of the vaccine manufacturers. AstraZeneca's there's a lot of political ill will around the management of the vaccine and how that was taken care of in Europe, and the fact that, yes, despite the fact that the UK managed to acquire preferential contracts, there were still contracts in Europe that were not delivered. And again, that's unfortunate, but that is a reality, and that has political blowback. I think the US situation is very, very different from the European situation in that the US very quickly moved. Obviously, the Trump administration did not offer money. I mean, they could have, but they didn't. Moderna got government money for the R&D work. Pfizer just had a guarantee of sale, and Pfizer took a big bet. Let's not kid ourselves. Yeah. Pfizer was building factories and running clinical trials simultaneously. They put several $1 billion down on the table. I mean, they made a big bet. Now, obviously, partially that's due to the confidence they had in the technology, and it was well-founded. But they did have a guarantee of sale, which took some of the pressure off. You didn't see that in Europe, obviously. Europe had a different approach. So I think, and obviously with the gamesmanship that's now being played around IP waivers, which will, let's not kid ourselves, will do nothing for the manufacturer of the vaccine, but will potentially give away a potential future cure for oncology. That to me is quite scary. Do we really want to be giving away the potential next generation cures for, say, the cancer, Lou Gehrig's disease, perhaps amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which increasingly in a lot of research seems to have a viral connection. What about potential? I mean, I'm already hearing that there's some companies, that one of the companies is working on an AIDS vaccine using mRNA. And which would make sense. It's a coronavirus that's probably very transferable. It's quite conceivable we could see a very effective AIDS vaccine very quickly. Do we really want to give that away? So I think there's a lot of political goodwill there, but I think unfortunately there's still a lot of political row to hoe from the standpoint of coming into the midterms. And and also I can't forget this: MFN passed. That was law. All right, now it was stopped through the legal action, and our economic impact assessment that we made previous to the work in HR3 was delivered as part of that court case, and there was an injunction filed of which our evidence was also given. But so we were part of that case, but that was law. And we can't kid ourselves. This stuff may happen. Absolutely.
So Duane, thinking about what, you talked about the impact on these kinds of practices, not even proposals in Europe. To me, the numbers just don't lie. So are they noticing, the impact on innovation, the impact on a patient access? Clearly someone cares, right? Are they doing anything about it? How do we again, take a look at what Europe has done and learn from that?
Well, I just I'm not going to mention the friend of mine, but obviously I work very closely to a lot of the European folks here who work in the industry and a lot of the European biotechs. And one of my very dear friends who works for one of the pharmaceutical companies here came from the came from the technology sector, from came from, I'll happy to say that, came from IBM, and then came from the telecom sector. And his opinion is, well, we lost the computer sector in Europe, and they lost the telecom sector in Europe, and they probably don't care about losing the pharmaceutical sector. Many people here are already saying, look, I mean, when you look at the numbers, as you say, they don't lie. The US is so profoundly dominant now in biotech innovation. It's not even close. That's a relatively new development over the last 10 years, that the biotech emergence, since basically the Medicare Pricing Act of 2003, the Medicare prescription drug benefit, that really turbocharged a lot of this activity. What's happening in Europe is finally, and this will probably increase, as I've mentioned, as drug companies are seeing, hey, this is having direct impacts on even politically right now, not even on pricing, but just reputationally. Coming in at this low price is impacting the politics on the other side of the Atlantic, where I'm generating 80% of my profit. It's not worth it anymore. And so you are starting to see companies walk. This will start impacting access. Until to date, it hasn't impacted into access. Europe's been willing to give away the biotech sector. It's been willing to walk away from it, it seems. Or they've been willing to take phase 2 bio creation and then let all the late stage value creation go to the United States, which is technically what's happening now. You're getting phase 2 here. There was one major acquisition that Abelinx was acquired by Sanofi. That was a French company acquiring a Belgian company. That's about the only one I can think of. That was $6 billion. That was about 3 years ago. That's the only one I can think of. Otherwise, all the acquisitions are still going on in the United States. So the only thing left for the companies, if it's reputationally hurting them politically now in the Congress, is they'll probably start walking. But then that gets into the IP waivers and compulsory license argument, and that could get very, very ugly. That's my concern.
Wow.
You mentioned your dad complaining about, right, like drug costs, like, yep, been there, done that, heard that.
Yeah, of course.
So based on, I mean, you've done so much research, based on the research, what do you tell people who say, why shouldn't Americans pay the same price as Europeans?
Well, it's not a fun argument. I'm not really fun at parties at that point, but it's again, I'll go back to the Thomas Sowell quote. There is no right and wrong. There are only trade-offs. Okay, there are only trade-offs. You're not going to get a 100%. There is no 100% solution here. We have a choice. We can either walk away from drugs and then potentially lose intellectual property through compulsory licensing, because if you don't exercise your patents, you will lose them. And trust me, half of the European politicians I speak to on a regular basis would love nothing more than to do that. And two, we just have to look at the fact that, we get drugs immediately in the US. Yeah. CAR T, you can get CAR Ts anywhere now in the United States, at basically any state. Most good oncology centers have CAR T. Half of Europe still does not have access to CAR T therapies. So if your stem cell treatment fails in B-cell lymphoma, you will die. You will go into hospice, or you'll just go on round after round after round of exceedingly and aggressively more chemo. That's a horrible situation to be in with no hope. And even late stage CAR T treatments are 40-50% effective. I mean, it's a very, very effective therapy. Now, again, it's autologous, it's expensive, it's open to cannibalization. We do see hospital exempted products. But what's intriguing to me is there's no discussion, there's no rational discussion about what the effectiveness of something like CAR T is worth for late stage, instead of doing all these very expensive chemo treatments. And again, I'll go back to the Sovaldi argument. I even have a deck I could probably, I'll just talk you through it. If we look at Sovaldi, Pharmacet was a New Jersey company that got acquired by Gilead. It's a cure. 98, 99% of the people are cured. Okay. Now, the 80,000, the $1,000 pill, 80 doses, cover of Time magazine, huge controversy, congressional investigations. What would happen when you didn't take Sovaldi? What was the best case scenario at that point? Well, the best case scenario was a drug called pegylated interferon, and pegylated interferon only worked 44% of the time. Now, that was also a $50,000 treatment with a lot of bedtime, and interferon was quite painful. It was an uncomfortable procedure. And so you divide 45,000 by 44%, you're already over $90,000. In other words, interferon per cure was more expensive, cure for cure, because you're spending it on something that doesn't work, and then you have more stuff you have to spend it on. It's more expensive, even head to head, than Sovaldi at $80,000. And nobody was paying $80,000 for Sovaldi. What happened? AbbVie came out 2 years later with their combo therapy, which was not as effective. They tried to gobble up market share by going down to $45,000. Gilead then dropped their negotiating price, confidentially, allegedly, down to match the AbbVie price. So again, that was halved. So if it was not effective, if it was cost effective at $80,000, it's hugely effective at $45,000. And then no one talks about what would happen to people that 66% who didn't, 56% who didn't respond to pegylated interferon. 1 out of 5 of those people required a liver transplant within 10 years. That's $720,000 of aggregate cost. Okay, so by the time you add all that up together and do your discount rates, blah, 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 you're somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 per treatment per patient. And meanwhile, Sovaldi's $40,000. Sovaldi's a bargain. Now, the problem is, from a standpoint of Medicare, the hospital treatment for your liver transplant, that's a Medicare Part B procedure. That's not Part D. The pill's Part D. Sovaldi. There's no mechanisms to claw back these pricing. There's no mechanisms to discuss the cost effectiveness. There's no total cost of ownership calculations going on. It's a black box. Plus, in Europe, I'll go back to CAR T here momentarily. If you look at how stem cell treatments are compensated in Europe, there's a block price of 18,000 euros. Here you go. That's it. There's no cost accounting. There's no overhead charges. There's nothing. So all of the extra manual labor that goes into a stem cell treatment, and trust me, there's over $200,000 of just hospital charges that go into a stem cell treatment, that just gets shoved onto the overheads of the hospital with no accurate costings. How are you going to compete against that in an HTA procedure? You're not. But then again, it's a rigged game. No one's looking at the actual costs here. We do at our firm. But very few people do. And of course, a lot of people don't get access to the data either. Fortunately, we do through some of our partnerships, but it's not easy, and people don't like hearing the truth, unfortunately. So the reality is, forcing this onto a drug company to try and negotiate with a government who is already saying no, 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 no. I don't see how this works with the drug company trying to take this on. I really see this as going to have to become a trade issue for this really to move. And we've been saying this now for 3 years. I just don't see any other solution to it, really. I really don't.
Scary. So, and to our audience, we welcome your questions in the chat box. There is one in there. We sort of answered that with a previous question. So Duane, we had asked you to take a look at, New Jersey. There's a prescription drug affordability board proposal on the docket. And we asked you to take a look at that. Would love your thoughts relative to our conversation today, please.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, I've not done the deep dive, and we haven't run the economics on it, so I don't know. But I will say this: the bill's bereft of technical details. It's quite good in sky high rhetoric. It's quite lacking in, shall we say, clinical application. 30%. Drugs that cost more than $30,000 a year, or a drug that has more than a $3,000 a year price rise. Again, sure, that if that's your benchmark, or anything over $30,000, we're going to decide it's not affordable. Okay, based on what? I gave you the Sovaldi example. You're actually losing money in that case if you try. What do you? I don't know what the goal of the bill is, aside from just to penalize drugs that are expensive for. We feel that these drugs are expensive. That's basically what the bill says. I will say this, without a rigorous methodology or without a goal that's clearly stated as to what the purpose of this is. New Jersey is the second largest biopharma market, according to our research in the United States. Look at what's happened in Europe. I would be very, very cautious about looking at this application. Look at what's been happening in California. There's 18 billion in tax revenue that's left the state over the last 2 years through the COVID, that's moved to Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida. A lot of those are businesses. I don't need to mention Elon Musk has moved his business out of California. You have a pharmaceutical sector because the conditions are conducive to having a pharmaceutical sector. You could chase it away, as we've seen in Europe. Liquidity does move, and if you're costing companies artificially their R&D, the economic study I pointed out earlier that showed the more exposure you have to a state that is putting cost controls on, that actually impacts your competitiveness globally, because you're weighing down things related to bureaucracy, which does have an onerous impact on companies' overheads, because you're spending more time focused on the bureaucracy of the state. People will avoid that state eventually. I'd be careful. Again, I don't know specifically. There aren't specifics there. But everything I've analyzed, both compared to HR3 and the dynamics of the European market, says you start putting in these cost controls like that, you will lose, your biotech sector will be reduced, because it will be. That's just the nature of the game.
We have time for one last question. And through my time at GSK and then my decade at Merck, I always said, we come with a white paper and the opposition comes with a bumper sticker. So what is your bumper sticker that we should use around the NIH funds all therapeutics argument?
Without industry, no drugs. Without industry, you don't get drugs. That's it. Without private investments, those things don't come to market, period. Statistically, I mean, we've run the data. And I wanted to make sure we had a good statistical model there, because invariably, when we speak to folks who think that it is the public sector that drives it, well, this is just a fact. It's axiomatic, because the more money you put in, the more likely you are to get a drug. No, absolutely not. In fact, I didn't show the data, but we show that the more money the NIH puts in, the less likely there is. The greater the percentage that NIH puts in as just a raw number, the less likely that drug is to come to market. Now, is that because potentially they're doing research that isn't market driven necessarily? We don't know, but statistically, that's what the model says. I don't say that, but what I can say is the private market overwhelmingly statistically drives the success of assets. The NIH does not. It is not statistically valid as a model. Now, that's our model. There was also a study that was done out of the University of San Diego that looked at their cohort from 1990 to 2000, which is kind of how we went down this road. They did it as a mean test, the standard error test. It assumes normality, which is why we went nonlinear logistically, because it's a more robust model. Regardless, they had a similar result. If you spun out of the university and you were a recipient of NIH funding, you had a lower probability of success. And the highest probability marker of success was the size of the initial public offering. And it's intriguing. Our results sort of mirror those in a slightly different way. But again, it's the private market that's driving success. You can't kill the private market, or you will kill success. It's the only way I can say it.
I know, Jennifer, you're going to close it out in just a moment, but just on the theme of bumper stickers, I have two. So number one is our industry saved the world, right? Yeah. And the other thing is get vaccinated, everyone. Thanks, Duane, so much. And Jennifer, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Duane. This was very helpful. And I shared the link in the chat to everyone for your website. Debbie, thank you for, as always, I love to host things with you, and eventually we'll do it in person. So thanks everyone for being here, and we appreciate it. All right, take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Threats to Innovation, Foreign Price Controls, brought to you by NewYorkBIO in partnership with BioNJ. Follow us on Twitter at NewYorkBIO, keep up with us on LinkedIn, and check out our website, www.newyorkbio.org.